Have you ever really thought about what happens in those first moments after death, before the final judgment? Well, in the Islamic tradition, there's this whole concept for it called the barzakh. It's like an intermediary stage that takes place in the grave. And today, we're going to dive into what the tradition says about our actions in this life and how they can have some very real, very direct consequences right after we die. It's the big question, isn't it? The one that touches every single one of us. And while lots of different traditions have answers, we're going to focus in on the Islamic understanding of what happens right away, in that period inside the grave, long before the day of judgment even arrives. So, to get our heads around this, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the specific actions that are said to cause punishment in the grave. Then, we're going to tackle a really fascinating scholarly puzzle where different sacred texts seem to say opposite things. We'll unpack how early scholars figured that out, then we'll explore ways to actually protect ourselves, and finally, we'll ask the big question: is this punishment forever, or is it temporary? Okay, first up, let's talk about the causes. Islamic texts are actually super specific about certain things we do in our lives having direct consequences in the grave. And it's not just about being a vaguely good or bad person. It's about specific, identifiable deeds. What's really striking when you look at a list like this is just the sheer range of actions. I mean, you've got the huge theological issues like unbelief, right? But then you also have something that might seem kind of minor, like neglecting personal hygiene. You have social poisons that can wreck communities like gossip and arrogance. And then there are financial issues that trample on other people's rights, like dying with debt you never plan to repay or dealing in usury. This is definitely not a complete list, but it gives you a really good idea that our actions, both big and small, are seen as carrying some serious weight. All right, now we get to something I think is just fascinating. It's a real intellectual challenge that the earliest Muslim scholars had to deal with. What do you do when two completely authentic sources seem to contradict each other? And this isn't some modern problem, Scholars have been wrestling with this stuff for centuries. So here's one side of the puzzle. This is a narration from the Prophet Muhammad, and it was passed down by one of his absolute closest companions, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Now, on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right? The actions of living people, in this case their loud wailing, can actually cause a dead person to be punished. But then you have this. This is a foundational bedrock principle from the Quran, which is, of course, the highest source in Islam. And it says, without a doubt, that no one will ever be held accountable for the sins of someone else. You are responsible for your own stuff, and that's it. Full stop. So there's the clash, laid out right in front of us. On one side, a report says you can be punished for what other people do. On the other, the Quran says, no way, that's impossible. So how on earth did the early scholars figure this out? This is where you really get to see the intellectual brilliance of the tradition shine. What's so crucial here is that the scholars didn't just ignore this problem or pick a side. Nope, they developed these really sophisticated methods to analyze it. The whole point wasn't to just throw out a narration, but to understand it in its proper context and make sure it lined up with the absolute core principles of the faith. And one of their key tools is something called Matan criticism. Now, a lot of the science of hadith is about checking the chain of narrators to make sure it's authentic, like checking a source's credentials. But Matan criticism looks at the content itself, the actual text. The idea isn't to say the prophet was wrong, but to check if maybe a narrator misheard or misunderstood or misremembered a key detail, especially if what they're reporting seems to clash with a non-negotiable principle, like the one from the Quran we just saw. And here you can see that nuance in action. Scholars came up with several brilliant solutions. Aisha, the prophet's wife, argued that the narrator simply got it wrong, that the prophet was actually talking about an unbeliever's existing punishment being increased by their family's wailing. Another view says, well, it only applies if the dead person basically let wailing be a family tradition and never told them to stop, which would make them responsible. But a third, really insightful take looks at the Arabic word for punishment itself, adhab. Turns out, it doesn't just mean torment, it can also just mean distress or hardship. The prophet even called the difficulty of travel adhab. So maybe the dead person isn't being punished at all. They just feel pain and distress, seeing their family grieve so intensely. So while that whole debate about wailing is a super interesting peek into how scholarship works, the bigger point is crystal clear. Avoiding major sins, whether they're social, financial, or spiritual, is really the key to finding peace in that intermediary state. Okay, we've talked a lot about the causes and the problems, so what about the solutions? The good news is the tradition doesn't just point out what's wrong, it offers some really clear pathways to protection. These are actual things we can do in this life to help safeguard ourselves in the next. So, what does this spiritual toolkit look like? Well, the sources mention several things. Dying as a martyr or while guarding the borders of the community is seen as a direct path to safety. But for most of us, it's about consistency in the good that we do. Our regular prayers, fasting, our charity, these deeds are said to literally form a protective barrier around a person in their grave. Then there's reciting specific chapters of the Quran, making sincere prayer, and even something like the timing of one's death, like passing away on a Friday, is considered a sign of grace. Now, one of the most powerful protections that's emphasized over and over is reciting a specific chapter of the Quran called Surah Al-Mulk. It's actually known as the preventer of the punishment of the grave. And you want to know the most amazing, accessible thing about it? It's only 30 verses long. Just 30! That makes this incredibly powerful spiritual shield feel totally within reach for pretty much anyone to memorize and recite regularly. And maybe the most direct tool of all is simply asking for protection, making supplication or dua. The Prophet Muhammad himself constantly prayed to be protected from the punishment of the grave, often right after his daily prayers. What you see here is a part of that prayer, and it gives us a clear, powerful template for anyone who's seeking that exact same protection. So this all leads to one final, really crucial question. If a believer does end up facing some kind of consequence in the grave for their sins, is that it? Is it permanent? Or is there an end to it before the day of judgment? Well, according to the scholars, the answer is it depends. It depends on the person and their deeds. For those with really severe sins, yeah, the consequences might last all the way until the day of judgment. But for other believers, it's seen more as a temporary purification process, a period that lasts long enough for their sins to be accounted for, and then it stops. And this leads us to a truly beautiful and hopeful idea. The tradition really emphasizes that the connection we have with our loved ones isn't just severed by death. Sincere prayers from the living, charity given in the name of the deceased, and the heartfelt supplications of family and friends, all of these are believed to have the power to actually lessen or even completely stop any suffering they might be experiencing. So as we wrap this up, the core message really isn't about fear. It's about mindfulness. It's about understanding that our actions here have real echoes in the hereafter. But it's also about knowing that the doors of mercy and protection are wide open through simple, consistent good deeds and sincere prayer. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought to reflect on. What's one small, consistent deed that you can start today to begin building a better tomorrow?